If you're anything like me and hate fun, then you don't play games for enjoyment, but for literally any other reason than enjoyment. My favourite being to look at all of a game, including its flaws and limitations, to try and find new reasons to play it past the original or obvious intention. You know, purely for the artistic appreciation, but also because I'm cheap and like getting my money's worth. Flaws and limitations, like how outdated it might be, intentional hidden parts, how overly ambitious the developers were, or just because it's generally shit and not fit for its intended purpose, like why people still play Bad Rats or watch me. All of them though have the potential to turn a game into anything. My favourite though, evident by the fact it's the one I never shut up about, is the feeling of canopsia. How eerie and unsettling a location becomes when it should be wall-to-wall bustling with people, noise and movement, but isn't, because creating digital environments is such a fragile and delicate art to nail perfectly. Which is a really nice way to say they fuck it up a lot. Obviously, we can just assume that that feeling exists, because if a place is empty, there's more than likely a reason for it that must have saved enough lives to deeply ingrain it into our genetic memory. And don't worry, the extent to which I'm really gonna dive into that as if I'm someone who has any idea what I'm talking about ends there. Instead, I'm just gonna talk about some examples of video games. More specifically though, a certain type of video game. The type that you only ended up barely playing to begin with, only out of some sense of curiosity, and that you sure as fuck don't intend on ever going back to. So, if only to say that you had really experienced everything the game has to offer, that you've at least seen the whole game, you also fire up the obligatory, sometimes tacked on multiplayer mode on your own, if only to reluctantly cover it once you had finished everything else. And not because you don't have any friends, even if that means just walking silently around maps made entirely around fast-paced competitive gameplay, except slowly and in silence. Which is sad, yeah, but you've done it, don't lie. And any of you that have would already be familiar with the point I'm gonna be making in this video, and that's the sheer force in which a game's multiplayer maps can go from this
open head surgery.
to this.
3, 2, 1, go!
The one rule I pointlessly enforce on myself for no reason whatsoever other than to restrict any fun is that I avoid using horror games as an example for this, because that one feeling I go in looking for can usually be dismissed as intentional, but now that I'm thinking about it, that also absolutely applies to war games about war and that have war in them as well. Since if it's trying to be realistic, it's always handled really seriously, because it's a serious subject, and I don't know about you, but next to cricket, the least fun thing I can think of would probably be war. And the most not fun of all wars has to be either one of the World Wars. So World War Zero, a game based in an alternate universe where World War I and II combine to make one unstoppable super war, is probably not how I want to kick off this video. But regardless, its inexperienced development team and beautifully obvious low budget jank to the point where they couldn't even properly populate their campaign missions means that its multiplayer maps are collectively such a perfect example of barren, cold, and weirdly not right environments that I couldn't not at least mention it. Walking around and exploring sucked me in and immersed me so much that catching myself walking around on player 2's perspective legit made me scream. Not in a nice way either, the words man-child and whimper come to mind. If ever there was something actually here though, something more than this, something to justify the unsettling feelings, it would definitely be here. The soundscape of distant gunfire, explosions, and general indicators that somewhere out there a lot of people are dying draws attention to the fact that this dense town isn't completely deserted, because it gives it life in a way, urgency. Like whatever happened either just happened or is about to. Which is ultimately where the unnatural feeling comes from here, because obviously, I mean, do I even need to say it? Guess what? It is just a fucking empty map. While I'm here though, covering war, risking my life on the front line, I also need to mention World at War, because for a game with a main menu like this, I wouldn't be entirely shocked if pressing start just played an hour-long snuff film. And it is a dark game, don't get me wrong, it's easily the darkest Call of Duty game in tone and colour, and the one that takes itself the most seriously, which ends up accounting for all of its atmosphere in every single level, including its multiplayer maps. But one. I'd be lying if I said this wasn't one of the easiest decisions I've ever had to make, but first an honourable mention has to go to this prison area from Hangar, which, saying the least, is not a super cheerful place on its own, what with the blood and corpse. That's usually the vibe that sort of thing tends to kill. But just hanging around for a good while, if you're into that sort of thing, triggers what is definitely the distant, muffled, ghostly screams of a prisoner just being brutally tortured to death. And that was just the honourable mention. Because like I said, below everything this game has, miles under, there's clearly something deeper going on with Asylum. I honestly just have no idea where to even start. Chains rattling, pipes creaking, drips, deep low-end rumbling. Oh, and the literal fucking sobbing ghost child stand out a bit. Again, it's really important to stress the point of this video, which is in a map designed entirely around a game mode that's supposed to look and play like this. Not doing that, instead, hard transforms the game entirely into this. Standing around in certain areas for too long triggers ghostly whispers that stereo pan behind you to sound like they're moving, out of sight. Piano melodies can be heard coming from non-existent rooms are all just some of the reasons I'm always clinically sleep deprived. Even this tiny area around this cutlery and pans was given its own super subtle, barely audible ambient track where they gently hit each other in the breeze. I'd be angry that they wasted so much effort and talent if it didn't mean that I wouldn't have been able to explore and discover this all on my own, amazed that I'm maybe like one of tens of other people that even care. Because every room in the entire map, and to some extent the game, has an entirely unique soundscape that are all unacceptably well designed, considering this literally could not be further away from how this game was meant to be played, especially on this map and in this mode, despite the colour palette, or lack of. Because if that tells us anything, it's either that there were some real miscommunication issues on what the game was meant to be between departments, or that it eventually became something they didn't intend, although again despite the colour palette having been sampled from Holocaust footage. Which is why it's interesting to then transition to Ubisoft's 13, not that it makes it any less jarring, because I'm almost certain we're in for a chance of at least a good one primary colour. Since 13 is of course famous to us most for making up that disgusting layer at the very bottom of every discount PS2 trash bin, never looking interesting or cheap enough to be actually worth buying, I've only recently, out of a combination of boredom, curiosity, and the straight charitable nature of my heart, given it the chance to impress me, to find that it's actually really fucking good, to be honest. I've been less wrong in my life. Being a brighter and faster game though, it's interesting to see if that hurts the feeling I'm looking for or exaggerates it, because like Quake for example, probably the fastest game, the environments have next to no visual or sound design in favour of just focusing entirely on optimising the layout and balancing the routes through each map because of the intended speed of the gameplay. And if you can't tell already, it basically takes a shiny set of keys to keep me entertained, so when I say that Quake's maps really do nothing for me, that's more than likely why. So starting with two honourable mentions, again, the maps FBI and Bristol Suites are reused and sectioned off areas of levels used in the game's story. The effect that had, though, is a feeling similar to open world games like GTA that are comprised entirely of smaller areas intended for specific missions but are accessible whenever. In that, on top of being eerily empty and unnaturally still because it's a multiplayer map, it also feels like it's in wait for something, because it literally is. What it's used for hasn't happened yet. The only way it could be more perfect is if you could hear ghostly voices in the distance screaming in pain as they're tortured to death. Oh, good. Which is the point. Yeah, it's meant to be dark at least. But it's weird because the story level associated with it is set up as this massive prison complex full of thousands of inmates, so the soundscape makes sense in that context, until you have none of that, in which case it pulls a complete 180 because your imagination kicks in, although I can't help but imagine how much better it would be having not played the story at all, because imagine is all I can do now. But in the end, I think, to be fair, original tailor-made multiplayer maps is asking a bit much, especially since the point of this video is to look at tacked on multiplayer modes. And trust me, this might as well be taped on, half hanging off the side with them awkwardly standing in front of it so you can't see it. But what about games that don't? Does having an exclusive contained theme within a multiplayer map specifically designed for multiplayer modes mean it's tonally deeper and as a result more vacant feeling? Or does that just make it a boring glorified arena? With a game like, I don't know, let's just say for example Time Splitters. That was meaningless. I was going to find a way to bring this up regardless. Where half the maps are unique to the arcade multiplayer mode and are all as insanely well designed as the campaigns, with their own completely original themes and little contained storylines. I'll be the only one to ever admit though that Time Splitters, despite being a really good example of one, at its core is just a really simple, brutally honest game that's elevated to one of the best of all time just through sheer variety, just for amassing the biggest collection of shit. 50 different guns, 150 characters, and maps set in every time period and in every theme you could think of, including, for some fucking reason, Venice. Why though? The only wars fought in Venice were during a time where guns weren't even used, which is blasphemous and unimaginable to a game series like this that only reluctantly got a baseball bat and melee attack 3 games in. I mean, I'm happy they did, it's my favourite map, but the whole thing definitely has an excuse for an employee excursion for research purposes flavour to it. Its layout even makes sense, connecting everything by narrow alleys and doors through joined buildings, so much so that it ends up feeling like a CSGO map in that, you know, it could well be a real place because it's as fucking dull and bland. So it absolutely at least stands out above the rest. But then you have, what's a common feature with all these examples, the weird lengths they went to add depth. I've mentioned the restaurant areas already, but obviously there's also an independently moving gondola, an uncomfortably fast one. Just visually, that image is a bit weird. And then there's the cathedral's bell chimes, the actual sampled bell chimes, by the way. For fuck's sake. It's not that it doesn't make any sense, because where else would they get it from? It's just that they really didn't have to. Being set at dusk is always a good start, but just because of the height of the surrounding buildings, you're always either moving through dark, cramped alleys or dimly lit rooms, not really helping with the feeling of being watched. The point I'm making, though, would be helped if I could hold my attention for more than a fucking second, is that the more thought and smaller details they add to an environment, especially if it's, like I've said, just an arena, the worse it looks when it's empty, because if it was just a sequence of textureless hallways, it would feel natural being empty. This, however, does not, exaggerated by the fact that it's a really fucking good map. So ideally, what I'm looking for, and that doesn't mean I want to say this, but Star Wars games are probably going to be the best examples, specifically Battlefront 2, since it's pulling from established source material which is, let's just say, detailed and extensive. No one's arguing against that. It's designed realistically to look and sound like the movies, benefiting from all the work put into that. Its budget and quality assurance from the companies producing it is literally unmatched. Its map size and player capacity is massive compared to other similar games, and pretty much all of them are themed to be either hellscapes or war zones, so shame it's fucking Star Wars. Like I said, I'm going with Battlefront 2 Classic, purely as a tactical decision because it has age over the newer one, so it's likely to be more lo-fi and imperfect, bringing all the jank that comes with that. And yet, though, it's still the better game, although I'll be honest, it's not winning any awards for its fish AI. When it comes to the maps, though, anyone would expect the darkest, smallest, most cramped one with the fucking Rancor pit and torture room to be the best example for this, because I did too. And yeah, sure, it's all of those things, but they're all also just gimmicks, strung together by hallways, like a really shit museum. It feels like it's just there for the drooling masses that want to clap and shout when they see something from the movies they recognise. Exactly like me, except it's with the Jedi Temple level. It benefits from being a Star Wars game because what other game would accommodate this kind of sprawling sci-fi skyline across from this quiet, dimly lit library all within some kind of religious spiritual temple? Star Trek? Yeah, probably actually. Again though, much less make it the stage in a game's multiplayer mode, so I appreciate it just existing on that fact alone, ignoring how nice and well designed the map is. Because still, just being a generic off-brand temple gives a lot to its atmosphere, since the intention behind their architecture is to make you feel small. I guess that dedicating so much clean space to something is meant to be intimidating. Will say though, not an expert, not that I feel it needs to be said when a dumb shit words it like that, because that's the point with any kind of religious building, and although I'm not sure where the template or inspiration came from, or if it was pulled entirely from established source material, regardless, it's translated perfectly, retaining all of those feelings. Some other highlights though include this well-lit garden area with these gold statues, this trippy maze-like server room, and again, this fucking cozy library that could only be more perfect if it had like some coffee there, and maybe... All of which, like I've also said, benefits massively from all the work put into the Star Wars movies' visual and sound design, because again, this is another example in which every room has its own unique ambient track, and you can only really properly appreciate them this way. Because I've been playing this game since it released, and I didn't even realise until doing this that the gonk droids made this fucking awesome low-end pulse sound. Hell yeah, I really hate getting so hung up on the sound design part, but that's definitely going in my 8-hour study mix to chill/murder younglings to. Otherwise though, it's the standard deal. Nice and dark, empty, huge, and definitely worth exploring past the fast-paced, loud, and hectic way it was intended. Because in general, and to abruptly conclude now while I have the chance, because this could quite literally just never end if I had my way, I guess if this whole thing could be summarised, me freaking the fuck out that not everyone else likes the same things I do would be fair. Because if nothing else, the strange, vacant and soulless feeling will always be there, but if everything else, all the hard work and effort that went into your favourite games might actually be noticed. But then there's also the sadness associated with it in a lot of cases, because it tends to happen with older multiplayer games where the community just dissolves, leaving it full of empty ghost servers, which really just sucks if it's a game you like. So I don't know, try it maybe. It's still chill as fuck and I love it. Although I have been talking this whole time about playing multiplayer games on my own, so maybe don't listen to me.